Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the journalist, author, filmmaker, and one-time musician and band manager. It is the one and only Jon Ronson, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love, poetry, and all that other groovy stuff. And had a very interesting, life in music, especially in the 80s and 90s. Managed the Manchester-based band The Man from Delmonte, and also was the keyboard player for Frank Sidebottom for a few years as well. So anyway, you'll find out more about that and much more. Anyway, yes, after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to that exciting subject that was the very early formative years. Jon, it's over to you.
You mean right at the beginning?
Yes. What was the kind of the music that you kind of heard in the house on the school bus? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I have a very huge memory of being on the school run and this song coming on the radio that was felt like just like a window into another and far better universe. And it took me ages. It was like punk, but it was like from the 60s. So I couldn't kind of figure it out. And it took me ages to work out what the song was. And it turned out to be Positively 4th Street by Bob Dylan. The way that the organ comes in at the beginning, this like incredibly angry organ. And that hit me, like between the eyes, that song. And it almost became like a sort of challenge. I need to find not only that song, but the world from which that song came. And actually now I live in Greenwich Village, like a block away from Cafe Wah, which is where Bob Dylan got his start, as did Bruce Springsteen and Lenny Bruce and all these other people. So I did end up at the heart of that. So there was that. There was, I remember a girl called Non Sadler introduced me to Lou Reed's Transformer.
Right.
That was a huge moment for me, and that got me into Bowie. And I think the other really big early memory was the White Album by the Beatles, just lying in bed listening to the White Album. These are all like songs from another world, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I had an older brother who was 7 years older than me, and that was the period where he'd obviously came of age during the mid-70s, and his was kind of prog rock, and I'd sneak into his room that I'd been forbidden to go into and get these kind of albums in his plastic sleeves and put them on and listen to, those Yes, Genesis, Rick Wakeman albums with great excitement. But he did have the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper and Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, which again, this was like the mid, if that, 70s. So there was no cultural baggage to these albums. They were quite, the Beatles had only just broken up, if you think about it. There was just were just around the corner. It was kind of weird. So there was no kind of, oh my God, Sgt. Pepper. It was just like a interesting thing, Sgt. Pepper. It was like, this is fascinating. And Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. So lyrically, they both had songs on them, which I was quite fascinated by, these stories that were told.
Well, we lived in Cardiff. The main thing was kind of heavy metal, I guess.
Oh, we loved heavy metal, didn't we?
There was a young farmers club up the street from us where they'd have heavy metal discos, and it would be Smoke on the Water, it'd be Deep Purple, it would be Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow and Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. But I never got really into that stuff.
No, but
it didn't really stick. It was too young male, I suppose. Never really worked for me, that stuff, especially Led Zeppelin. To this day, I don't understand the appeal of Led Zeppelin one bit.
No, my brother had Black Sabbath and Deep Purple in there, which I kind of liked some of the songs on those tracks because they were short and snappy, like Paranoid or Fireball or Burn, which were Deep Purple songs. And it was just like very dramatic. It was like, wow, this is amazing. But I didn't, then after that. But I came from a village and we had discos, and most of it was chart discos, but they would have a heavy metal bit where the boys would stand around in a circle, headbanging, in that way, which was just like, if only only one had filmed these moments, it would have been quite extraordinary to see it, really.
Circle jerks. My other big early memories was punk. I remember Pretty Vacant and Crass, which is a really sort of niche band to enter somebody like that.
Very. God, how did you get into Crass?
I think it must have been one of my brother's friends brought along.
So did you
Shane.
have an older brother who kind of directed you at all?
I wouldn't say he directed me, more sort of chucked me out of the room. So I guess the opposite of directed, excluded. But he was, he was the one who was into like Deep Purple. So I honestly don't think he got me into anything really. It was kids at school. The things I got really into young. The Beatles, Bowie, Lou Reed. They were things I'd found, or kids at school.
Did Roxy Music appear on your radar?
Actually, it took me a little while to get into Roxy Music. I didn't really get into Roxy Music till I was an adult. Oh, but I'll tell you what I got into hugely and still feel that way about is the first two Brian Eno albums.
Right.
Here Come the Warm Jets and Taking Tiger Mountain.
Blimey.
To this day, I like two of my most formative records, especially Here Come the Warm Jets. But Roxy Music, I did get into, but much later on. I don't know why. Maybe I was kind of conflating. It's sort of weird with Roxy Music, because one minute they're doing really amazing stuff like Mother of Pearl and Virginia Plain and Remake, Remodel.
Yes.
But minute they're doing these kind of awful songs like Avalon and so I found them like confusing, and it took me a little while to realize there were two Roxy Musics really.
Yes, there was two. It's funny you mentioned that because I was very uptight in the 80s and all angsty, so it's taken me years to sort of accept, things like Avalon is quite a nice song and I should just be a bit more relaxed about life. Whereas at the time I was quite horrified by it. But,
Yeah.
I just look back at my younger self thinking, just don't be so uptight and angsty all the time about everything, They're sold out.
True. Actually, Love is the Drug is an example of a Roxy Music song that I would have completely rejected at the time, but now can see the worth in. By the way, I met Brian Eno quite recently and went on and on and on about Here Come the Warm Jets and Taking Tiger Mountain, and I could tell quite quickly that he didn't want to, like, he was glad that I liked those records, but there was nothing else he could give me in that moment to enrich my life.
Yes. So when you got to that precious age of 16, that was like 1983, which was quite a major moment in musical history because that's when the Smiths appeared. Did they come into your consciousness at that stage?
Actually, a little bit later. I tell you what I think it was. Most of the music around that period was in the charts was very bad. Spandau Ballet, that whole Duran Duran. To this day, I find it really difficult to listen to those kind of 80s songs. Actually, the thing that kind of got me back into it in a way was Chapel Roan. It's nice to hear a sort of new person take that music and do something new with it, which is what Chapel has done. So she's made me like it more. But by and large, I hated all of that new romantic.
Yes, me too.
Yeah, and so I kind of didn't listen to new music for quite a long time. That was the period I was listening to Tom Waits and the Beatles and Bowie and that kind of stuff. And it was really only later on when I moved to London when I was about 18 that I realised there were some good bands that were coming up, like the Smiths.
Yeah. So when did you buy your first single and first album? What were they?
My first single was Call for Cats by Squeeze. Pink vinyl.
Nice.
And that would have been about 78 maybe, when I was probably 11 or 12.
Yes.
And my first album that I remember was the White Album by the Beatles.
Right, my God, you were straight in there. Were you still in Cardiff at this stage?
Yeah. Oh, I'll tell you what else I bought at a very young age was Are We Not Men, Devo, and Captain Beefheart, Trout Mask replica.
Wow, you just went straight in there, didn't you, with that one?
Well, Yeah, there was a very good independent record store in Cardiff. I think it's still there, called Spiller's Records, which is one of those pretty influential regional record stores. And so that's how I got to know about those more interesting things like Captain Beefheart and
My
Diva.
God, yes. I mean, it's impressive, the track Mars Replica, because it's one of those albums that I went to the record library, I got recorded, and then never really played it. Just occasionally to get the, oh yes, that's still quite different. But then I liked other more commercial, albums that he did. So I thought, wow.
Yeah, I think the only Captain Beefheart I'd listen to out of choice now is probably I Scream for Crow. That's still a good song.
Yeah, Electricity, and there's a lot of kind of punchy little numbers he did. It's a bit like the Incredible String Band. Every few years I'll have a go at listening to them, thinking I must try and get it, and think, no, I'm not. But it kind of makes me smile. And I think, being in the, an 80s indie kid, one attempts to get quite pretentious at this stage, isn't it, really, into films and movies.
But I kind of gravitated to those more niche, marginal bands because the mainstream music at the time was so bad. It was,
Yes.
83 when I was, 15, I guess, was just the worst time to be 15. Suddenly, Top of the Pops had gone from this incredibly exciting place where you might see Bowie or The Damned or whatever, to just these awful, Duran Duran type groups.
Yes, it was in that Trevor Horn production sound, which was quite, like, even now it feels quite horrendous, actually. That kind of studio stuff, which just sounded horrible. And I think it kind of increased my level of insecurity, because I just felt like I was never going to go to the Blitz Club and dress up with, wacky makeup and look gorgeous and fall in love with people. I was kind of not that kid, really. So, yes, it highlighted.
Exactly. Like, that sort of burden of like having to take ages to get dressed, like, and to think about what clothes you're going to wear and stuff like that. Suddenly that was like de rigueur for young men.
I know.
Like, fuck that. Like,
I know. So when you got to 16, you did A levels, you got them, and then went off to university. Sort of, was this 85?
yeah, I went to Central London Polytechnic
Right.
in 85. And the very first thing I did, probably the first week I moved there, was went to see Tom Waits at the Dominion Theatre, which remains one of the best gigs I've ever been to, I think. And then shortly afterwards, the Pogues at the Town and Country Club with Kirsty MacColl and Joe Strummer playing. So I immediately immersed myself in all of that stuff when I moved to London. I'd go to the Marquee and the 100 Club. I'd watch bands like, I remember seeing the Cardiacs, the Monochrome set. I got into all of that stuff.
Yeah, my God, that was good stuff. There's a new beautiful book about the Cardiacs that's just come out, which is worth tracking down. I did an interview with the guy who published it and produced it very recently, and yes, it's like everybody's mining this kind of 80s period now, aren't they, with documentaries and books and films, and as well as reunions and everything. So then after uni and seeing all these amazing bands, a glorious period, wasn't it? Tom Waits. I know it was here in I don't know. Oh, Swordfish Trombone was the album that I was with.
Oh, me too. So I wasn't particularly popular at school. In fact, quite the opposite. But there was this one kid called Will Davis who took me back to his house at lunchtime one day and played me Swordfish trombones, and that was a huge moment for me from the very first, second of the first song, which I think is Underground. Bom, bom, bom.
Yes.
Bom, like that. I was hooked and remained hooked.
And I think, I don't know, were you getting into films at that same time, like Jim Jarmusch and Betty Blue and that kind of culture of like Down by Law and Stranger Than Paradise and all those kind of those classics?
Yeah, and thank you for asking these questions because I'd love talking about this stuff. I would go and see the same films. I'm such a creature of habit. Like if I see a film that I like, I'll go back and see it 5, 10 times, or certainly back then I would. So the films I would see repeatedly back then were Stranger Than Paradise, Down by Law, Stop Making Sense, the Talking Heads concert.
Yes.
I saw that many times.
Did you see Rumblefish and there's a film called Diner with a young Mickey Rourke in?
Rumblefish, Diner. Some
The
of the other that came
actors.
out, The Outsiders, I didn't like quite so much. I was like another Rumblefish type film. Coriana Squatzy, I theoretically liked.
And did you start getting into kitchen sink dramas at this stage as well from the late 50s, like Taste of Honey and Saturday Night, Sunday Morning, and those A Kind of Loving as well? Did you start to sort of bring these into your repertoire?
No, I never got into that stuff. I always found it a little boring and dreary. So I never got into kitchen sink stuff. I'm trying to think the plays that I watched back then. Well, I got into Mike Leigh, Abigail's Party.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Yeah, that was because that's much more fun than John Osborne, Look Back an Angle or whatever.
Yes.
Yeah, I never got into that stuff. Weirdly.
And I don't know if it was the 80s or the 90s. Robert Altman was doing some quite epic 3-hour family dramas, which were quite harrowing, but we
Yeah.
loved
Oh my
we
God,
loved
yeah.
all those.
And funnily enough, I was thinking about Robert Altman the other day because I was in Tennessee and I was describing this town. I've just made an epilogue for this Audible show I made called The Debutante. I made it 2 years ago, but I was given some new information about the main character, so I would have made an epilogue episode. And I was in Tennessee, and I was like speaking into my microphone, like describing the town that I was in. And my first take was like, this is like a bleak town, everything's crumbling. And then my second take was like, this is a lovely town, it's very sweet. And it reminded me of, there's a scene in Robert Altman's Nashville, which is
Yes.
also set in Tennessee, where the British journalist played by Geraldine Chaplin does exactly the same thing that I was doing. She couldn't work out whether to be sniffy or positive.
Yes.
It really made me laugh for that. That I fell for that for a moment.
Well, yes, easily. Did he do a film called Naked? There was a film called Naked, which was sort of one of these epic films, which I can't remember if it was a Mike Leigh one, a bit more in the 80s. Oh
Yeah,
God, Mike Leigh did that film called Meantime with a young Meantime.
Jane
Did you ever?
Horrocks.
Pardon?
No, was it Jane Horrocks?
No, it had an amazing cast, which they all went on to do great things. And it was one of those. I don't know if you can remember when Channel 4 appeared in sort of 80, whatever, 3, and there was suddenly Richard Pryor live concert, and then there was Meantime, and then a few years later it was The Tube. So suddenly Channel 4 and My Dinner with Andre, which we all wanted to love and appreciate. But it was Mike Leigh, and it had Tim Roth, Gary Oldman, Phil Daniels in, and it was one of these really depressing films, as you can imagine, about living on a council estate, sort of slowly going nowhere.
Right. It'd be interesting to compare those Mike Leigh kitchen sinky films to the other ones, because I always thought of Mike Leigh as just being much more fun and good at observations about human absurdity rather than the kind of bleakness that somebody like John Osborne would leap into. And give me absurdity over bleakness any day. So I think maybe that's why I preferred Mike Leigh.
So in '83 he made a film called Naked, and that was really relentless.
That was David Pulis. Yeah, it was David Pulis kind of being this sort of just this sort of dark figure wandering around London. Naked was a very good film.
Yes, it was. And at that stage, you would have been absolutely there in the middle of Red Wedge, the Socialist Workers' Party, TVP, SWP, all those things. Were you embracing the Red Wedge movement at this stage? Because we were, because 79 Thatcher gets in, we had the Falklands miners, we have Greenham Common, nuclear war on our doorstep, that feeling of doom and depression. So what was it like in London in 80, 85, 86?
Well, I went to a couple of socialist workers meetings, but it was never for me. I remember somebody saying to me that the worst thing about, the thing about the Socialist Workers' Party is that none of them are socialists, none of them are workers, and none of them know how to have a party. So I got very bored going to the Socialist Workers' Party. Back then, I just thought they were just too, annoyed, just constantly annoyed about everything. That kind of wasn't for me. I was kind of never an ideologue. Also, I've never liked politics that tell you what to do. People don't like to be told what to do. And that was
Yes.
my problem with socialism, was that they all wanted to tell me what to do. But I did go to some of the gigs. I went to, I definitely saw Billy Bragg a couple of times back then.
Yes.
This is like adjacent to Red Wedge, but I saw the Pogues a load of times.
Did you really see the Redskins? They were around a lot in the 80s, mid-80s, weren't they? With a classic album called Neither Washington Nor Moscow.
That's right, but international socialism. That was the subtitle. No, I didn't. I didn't see the Communards. Years later, though, I saw that fantastic movie about that period. Oh God, what's it called? The one about the lesbian and gay group who try and raise money for the striking miners. Do you know this movie? It's so good, and honestly, this movie should be a big movie, and for some weird reason, it wasn't as big as it should have been. It makes me worry about the meritocracy.
Yes.
Will I tell you what it was called?
Yes, I do, because obviously that's one.
Movie about...
And also during this time, we had the comic strip was kind of very much on our radar, wasn't it? Did they kind of have a influence on you at all? Watching the young ones, then the comic strip, and their bad news, bad news.
Massively. By the way, the movie's called Pride, and it came out in 2014. It came out the same time that the movie I wrote, Frank, came out. So we were like up against each other at various awards and so on.
Oh.
But when I saw Pride, I thought this is like the new Billy Elliot or the new Delmonte. And for some reason, that never happened with it.
Oh, I'll be checking that out.
I very much recommend it, and I recommend it, and people listening to it should check out this movie. It's
Pride.
about the moment, and it's superb. I mean, the end will have you in tears.
Yes, well, that's what we did a lot in the 80s, so that's all good. The
comic strip, that was all huge influence on me. The Young Ones. In fact, there was at one point, a bunch of people, including Jules Holland, did a cover version of Subterranean Homesick Blues on The Young Ones, which was another big musical moment for me. That's worth looking out. It was very cool.
Jules Holland, that one. I remember the Motorhead Damned and also Alexis Sell doing songs. I can't remember Jules. I mean, yes, they were all there, weren't they? Julian Clary. I mean, it was kind of. Did you sort of dip your toe into being a vegetarian at this stage?
No, not until I wrote Okja in 25 years later. I became a vegetarian for a little while.
Yes, there you go. So you finished your degree. Is that in media studies in London?
Yeah, but I didn't finish actually. I only did. I never graduated. I did 2 years, and then I became the social secretary for the Polytechnic of Central London. So my 3rd year at college was a paid sabbatical.
Fantastic.
And that's when I started putting on bands and comedians and so on.
So this was kind of 87 time.
87. Yeah.
My God!
And 86.
And was this kind of a golden ticket that you got at this stage?
For comedy, definitely. My comedy show that I put on, it was called Frank's Wild Tuesdays, and it was very successful. We had every up and coming. We had Vic Reeves before Bob Mortimer came along. Like that's
yes. Did you get Stuart Lee at this stage?
I'm sure we had Stuart Lee. I'm sure we did. I remember we had Joe Brand, Jerry Sadowitz. He caused trouble.
Oh my God! Yes, I went to saw him a few times.
Yeah, "Fuck the Pope." That's his first line. Nelson Mandela, what a cunt. Eddie Izzard. Other people you may remember less, like James Macabre. But
did you get into any kind of performance people? There was the Iceman who used to have a block of ice that he melted on stage. I remember at the Edinburgh Festival seeing a man who put a firework up his bottom, and that
Chris
was the
Lynam. His name was Chris Lynam.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, Chris the Piss, and he would end with putting a firework up his arse and then lighting it. Yeah, I have him, and he lit the firework in my bar on Bolsover Street. Yeah, I saw him. There was the Brighton Bottle Orchestra, who were part of that scene, who would they play the bottles.
And what about Malcolm Hardy? Was he there? Arthur Smith?
Oh yeah, yeah. I actually knew Malcolm Hardy very well back then. I was,
Right.
yeah. I was at the Tunnel Club um, when. Well, one time I was at the Tunnel Club, which was Malcolm Hardy's club, but I was talking to him outside, and we're chatting away, and suddenly goes, "Uh-oh!" And this woman came up to him and smashed him over the head with her umbrella, and went, "You cunt!" And then another time I was at the Tunnel Club, and Malcolm Hardy pissed on the audience. He got out his penis and urinated on the audience. And I saw this happen. And years later, after he died, um, it turned out, I can't remember who told me, but it told me that everybody would like, a bit like seeing the Sex Pistols at the Free Trade Hall, everybody would talk about seeing Malcolm Hardy urinating on the audience, but nobody had actually ever seen it. But I saw it. So that was like, for some people in a niche way, that was like a moment.
You were there. That was your JFK moment. My God.
Yeah,
And there was another couple were they called Raw Sex?
Yeah, I remember Raw Sex. I remember this woman called Hattie Hayridge.
Oh, yes, God.
I always remember she came over to me one night at the Tunnel Club and said, because she'd just been on stage and everybody was yelling, like, "Can't get off the stage, you can't." And then she came off stage and was like, looking kind of rattled. And she came over to me and we were talking. And she said that some man had come up to her and said, "I just think it's outrageous what just happened to you. Everybody yelling like cunt." And, that was like completely outrageous. I just want to apologize. And she said to him, "So you didn't yell cunt?" And he goes, "No, I would never do that." He said, "I yelled burn the witch."
Yes. God.
That was quite a place. My goodness.
Excellent. That was good. And then around that time, there was this kind of golden period of indie music between 83 and 87, which was basically the years of the Smiths. And then they broke up. That felt like a kind of a schism of some type. And then ecstasy came along. And then the next wave of 16, 18-year-olds want their kind of sound. And it sort of becomes a bit dancey and then it becomes grungy. So what then happens after your 1 year post in the Ents department here?
Well, I became friendly with two acts. Actually became friendly. I remember, because your show's called C86. I remember Tallulah Gosh used to hang around.
Oh, Amelia.
Yeah, Amelia used to hang around, and so I always remember feeling very excited when Amelia and the other woman from Tallulah Gosh's name I can't remember.
Probably Claire. It probably isn't Claire, is it? But a lot of people were called Claire in the 80s.
Right. Well, they used to hang around the bar where I was putting on the shows, but the two bands I became friendly with were the man from Delmonte and the Frank Sidebottom O'Gladly Big Band. So after my year's sabbatical, they both kind of invited me to move to Manchester. The man from Delmonte to manage them, and Frank Sidebottom to be the booking agent and keyboard player. So that's why I never did my third year. Instead I quit college and moved to Manchester to be with those two bands.
Right. Did you start writing? Were you writing articles at this stage?
Yeah, I was writing for the college magazine, and I had this very big formative moment where one of my lecturers, David Cardiff, who was married to Lynn Barber, we were all incredibly impressed because he was married to Lynn Barber, and Lynn Barber at the time, and really thereafter, was a huge influence on young journalists. She was so funny and scabrous and just so elegant, like having Dorothy Parker in our midst.
Yes.
And David Cardiff was married to Lynn Barber, and he took me to a cafe one day, the Soho Poly Cafe on Ridinghouse Street, and said, "You're the only person who writes for the college magazine who knows how to write." So that always stayed with me as, okay, well, maybe I'll have to be, if that's the thing I do well, then maybe I have to be a writer. So I wrote for the college paper, and I had a couple of things published in Smash Hits as well.
Right.
And then when I moved to Manchester, I started writing for City Life, which was Manchester's Time Out.
Right.
So I carried on writing there.
Did you ever come across a Manchester band called The Passage?
No.
XYOYXY or something like that. You never sort of came into. Didn't come onto your. They were quite an arty sounding band. The Passage.
But no,
Yeah.
no, don't remember them at all.
Right.
At the time, who was it? There was a lot of good bands around at the time. The Man for Delmonte, the Inspiral Carpets, 808 State. Then there was New Fast Automatic
Yes.
Capital.
Well, I suppose you had the Mondays. Then you had a guy called Gerald, didn't you, as well?
Yeah, I had all of them, and unfortunately, I went to all the sort of iconic shows of the time. I went to the Happy Mondays at GMEX, which was their big show, and the Stone Roses at Spike Island. I went to that. And I also saw the Stone Roses and James at the International too, which
Oh my
became
God! Of
a bit of a
course.
kind of legendary show. Um, and at the Boardwalk, which was a much smaller venue, I'd see They Might Be Giants, and yeah, so I was there for a lot of the great gigs of the time.
Yes, and then you had the 4AD was sort of getting more popular, and there was the Pixies and Throwing Muses as well, wasn't there, coming through, which I do
Mm.
remember. Did you ever do Glastonbury at this stage? Was Glastonbury on your radar?
Probably not that early. I think the first time I went to Glastonbury would have been like mid-90s, so a little bit later on. But yes, I became an obsessive Pixies fan. I followed them around. I saw them probably 10 times. Uh,
Right,
and I got to know Kim Deal a little bit. My roommate at the time was a woman called Paula Greenwood, who ran the record label that the Inspiral Carpets were on, and she was dating Josephine Wiggs from the Pixies, so from the Breeders, sorry. So I had a kind of connection to the Breeders and the Pixies, and also Chas Banks, who was the Pixies tour manager, lived in Manchester, so he would tell me, if you go to Scarborough on Thursday, the Pixies are doing a secret gig at this little hotel in Scarborough. So I'd go and see the Pixies over and over again.
my God, that's so magic, isn't it? That is really
Yeah,
nice. Yes.
really.
So when you said yes to being the manager, the man from Delmonte, what were they looking for at that stage?
Well, they looked like they were going to happen, to be honest. Basically, in the same way that the Smiths had championed James and had them as their support band all the time. James did the same thing to the Man from Delmonte. So the Man from Delmonte was supporting James a lot. Before me, their manager was Martin McDonough, who was James's manager.
Right.
About the single "Water in My Eyes," which was, getting played on TV and on the sort of indie shows at the time. So it really looked like the Man from Delmonte was going to happen, and Martine quit managing the band, I think, because James just sort of shot off into space and needed Martine's full attention.
I guess
Uh,
Sit Down came out about 1990, didn't it? 91.
yeah, so actually that was kind of quite a lot later, because I'm talking now like 87, 88, when Martine stopped managing the Man from Delmonte and they asked me to take over.
Yes. And what does that mean, on the world of admin and, I don't know, signing bank account? What does managing a band consist of at this stage?
There was a lot of cutting and pasting things into posters.
Right.
A lot of that was happening. Uh, I'd book the gigs, but eventually we got an agent who would book the gigs. But I was like dealing with them all the time. They were
Right.
also John Cale's agents. That was exciting to have to share an agent with John Cale.
Well, yes, absolutely. That must have felt really exciting at that stage.
Yeah. And, this was the stage when the Man from Delmonte was actually doing really well. In many places, we were always bigger in Manchester and London than anywhere else, but still would go to like Leeds and Sheffield and get really good response, really good reactions. And I thought the Man from Delmonte were just fabulous, just so good. I was sure they were going to be big stars, and I was seeing the future of music. And maybe
Yes.
that would have happened in a slightly parallel universe.
But then, because they did Water in My Eyes, Drive, 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 Will Nobody Save Louise, all
Yeah.
on Ugly Man Records. Were you struggling to find a record label for them at this stage?
Yeah, so I came along just after Water in My Eyes. So I was around for Will Nobody Save Louise and My Love Is Like a Gift You Can't Return and all the songs thereafter. Um, and yeah, there was a label called Bop Cassettes who wanted to sign us and were about to. And I think Bop did put out a few things.
Yes.
Um, but we'd go down to London and have loads of meetings with record companies, and we just didn't get signed.
So
I
then,
wonder if another manager, a manager who'd come in more Alan McGee-like and, bang the table or whatever, would have had more luck than me. I don't
it was
know.
a bit of a tricky period, wasn't it? Because Bleach had just come out, and there was this kind of different kind of vibe coming from America in a way. I mean, we'd had hair metal as well, which was sort of slowly sort of dying down, but there was still that sound. And indie pop. I remember talking to people from, I don't know, like the Primitives and the Mighty Lemon Drops, and they were like struggling to find anybody interested in their next album or their next tour. It was almost like their fans were like moving on. So I could imagine the sound of the man from Delmonte was starting to struggle to pick up
Yeah.
that momentum, really.
Well, what killed us was the Stone Roses and the Happy Mondays. When they came along and got so big. And of course, the Stone Roses changed a bit. When you listen to the early Stone Roses, songs like uh, is it called So Young, their very first song?
Oh God, I
Um,
don't know.
uh, but anyway, it sounded kind of Manfred Delmonte-ish, it's very guitar-y and jangly. But then by the time the first Stone Roses album came out, and got more dancey, She Bangs the Drums and all of that stuff, um, it was what you said before. A new genre comes along and dazzles everybody,
Because I
and
remember
then
the Happy Mondays had a John Peel session in about 87, and then there was that first album called Bummed, wasn't there? Which was kind
yeah,
of,
Bummed,
it
and
was
then there
quite,
was
it was a bit of an acquired taste. It wasn't, I was like, well, I know everyone rated it, but it wasn't that easy to listen to, I didn't
yeah. To
think.
this day, actually, I'm doing some DJing once in a while, and I find it difficult to find Happy Monday songs that I still want to play. To be honest, it's
Yeah.
the hard edge to the Happy Mondays that I did love at the time, and I loved going to see them, but there was a sort of hard edge to it that the Manfred Monty didn't have, and they were so good at it.
Yeah,
Uh,
and also New Order had brought out Technique, which was this really glossy album, which was like every song was a hit, wasn't it? Almost. It was such a commercial album, and there was bright and breezy, beautiful cover. I went to see them at the NEC, and the Happy Mondays were supporting at that stage, and
right.
they were like a happening band. And also you had people like Prince. I remember going to see Prince a few times. I can't, it's bizarre thinking back on it, but he'd just done Sign of the Times and Love Sexy, and it was like, oh yeah, I'll go and see Prince. And it was like, blimey, that's rather
Yeah.
exciting. So
Amazing. I saw him a couple of times back then.
yes. So
But yeah.
and how was it going with Frank at this stage? Was he coping? Because I'd seen the film, and I did an interview with a person who did a film about Frank Sidebottom a few years ago, I think.
Oh, the guy from Cardiff, the director of it.
Yes, who sort of explained a little bit about what it was like working with Frank and the film that came out. Yeah, he said it was really strange. He had a story which was like, oh yes, the Frank, the story that inspired the movie. Oh yeah, there was a film, wasn't there?
Well, there was two films, but I was involved in one of them. So basically, there was a fiction film, which was kind of inspired by Frank Sidebottom, but also inspired by um, Captain Beefheart and Daniel Johnson and the Shags. This sort of tribute to outsider artists with Michael Fassbender playing the Frank character. And I actually wrote that film with Peter Strawn, who just won an Oscar last week for Conclave. And then there was a documentary called Being Frank, which was a documentary about Frank. So I'm not sure which of the two you're.
Actually, I've seen both of them, but I'd forgotten about that first one, Frank, called Frank, which was, I didn't realize it was yours, but maybe it was the other one, because I remember the director having a story where he actually saw the chap laying there as he had he had to mic him up because he was on telly, and it was a bit of a strange scene, and the character who is Frank Sidebottom he just said it was a bit of a weird moment. It was a bit like, oh, okay, I don't know. It was just, it was a long time ago, but he said it was a bit strange. What was it like working with Frank Sidebottom?
It was kind of magical. I mean, on one level, it was very magical. I've often said, that nothing makes a young man feel more alive and on an adventure than driving up the M6 at 3 o'clock in the morning, sitting next to a man wearing a big fake head. Uh, you felt like Alice, I was Alice through the looking glass. So on one level, that was very magical to be in this avant-garde group of people, and the audience loved it. This was Frank's peak, so pretty much everywhere we went, we'd get a couple of thousand people, and people absolutely loved it. On the other hand, 3 o'clock in the morning, some of the other members of the band took a baffling and irrational dislike to me, which I got my revenge on when I wrote the movie. I made Maggie Gyllenhaal's character this sort of grotesque, monster based on some members of the band that I didn't like. So, so it was sort of mixed. There was an element to the Frank Sidebottom band that was quite sort of laddie and drink and drugs and all of that stuff, which was never anything I was interested in. I was much more interested in the kind of avant-garde magic of being in a band where the singer wears a big fake head that he never takes off.
How did you get into playing keyboards with Frank?
Oh, well, the story was that it was just before I became the social secretary, and I was in the office that I was soon to take over, and the phone rang, and it was Frank's manager, Mike the manager, and he said our keyboard players had some health issues. I think it was Mark Radcliffe, actually. Our keyboard players had some health issues, so we're going to have to cancel the show tonight unless you know any keyboard players. So I said, I play keyboards, and he said, well, you're in. And I said, but I don't know any of your songs. And he said, can you play C, F, and G? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, you're in. So that's how I joined the band.
Blimey. So how many years were you in the Frank Sidebottom band?
I was probably in the band for like maybe 2 or 3 years on and off, mostly.
Did you ever go into the studio with them and record anything?
No, the studio recordings were all just Chris, just Frank. But I played all the live shows for a number of years, and I booked them as well. I became his agent, so I booked them. So I was actually making some pretty good money then. I was making I was getting paid £40 to perform, and I was getting 10% of the So sometimes I was making like £200 a night for, in the late 80s I probably wasn't even 20 years old.
Yeah, my God, you were doing it.
Yeah.
You were living that dream. Blimey. And what was Chris like when he wasn't Frank? Was he all right?
Yeah, quiet, a little wayward, um, you know, quiet and a little wayward, I would say. Also, I've got a memory of him one time, he'd wear a nose peg under the head to get the voice like that.
Yes.
And the nose peg would like dig into his nose. And I'd watch him take the head off at the end of the show and take the nose peg off and wince in pain because the nose peg had like dug into his nose so bad. So being Frank Sidebottom was painful.
Yes, I could imagine. My God. That was just interesting because at that time there was a lot of those other acts. I just remember for some reason thinking about people like the Frank Chickens. They were one of those other bands at John Peel, and they were playing a lot of benefit concerts and on that alternative circuit as well, which would have probably been some things that you would have probably come into your sort of orbit and consciousness.
Yeah, I definitely remember them, but I don't remember anything at all about them.
So how did it finish with? Did Frank just move on? Did you?
I was fired for tax reasons. He owed £30,000 back taxes. The story goes, I wasn't there to witness this myself, but the story goes that he stood up in court as Chris, not Frank.
Yeah.
So with his own head, not a fake. And the judge said, £30,000. This is a very serious matter. Have you considered a payment plan? And Chris apparently said, would £1 a week suffice, my lord? And the judge said, no, it would not. So that's why we were fired. We were fired because he owed the Inland Revenue all of that money, and he decided to, if he wasn't paying the band £40 a night each, that was all money that he could keep.
Yes. Oh, yes, I suppose that was. And did you come across at that Manchester time? Did you come across Tony Wilson much? And
a little, yeah. He was always in a sort of, ivory tower. I felt that Tony Wilson was like way above my level. So I did meet him a couple of times, but I found him this sort of, intimidating, faraway figure.
yes, it would have been there. And then how did the end of the Man from Delmonte come about? Can you remember? Was it a particular moment?
It was, but it was definitely a sort of personal, you know, Mike gave an interview quite recently from the band where he said that the band ended because relationships changed. And I think that's a very, that's a very, fair way of putting it without reopening any old wounds.
Oh,
Basically,
no.
things changed. However, I saw them all the other night. They reformed and played their first show in
Yes.
Manchester, so I saw
Suddenly,
them.
this incredible story with a man called Ian Lee. Was it
Yeah,
Ian who's been the catalyst to all this? So
yeah,
that was 1990. We jump forward. Oh my God.
2025, 35
Yes,
years.
a long time. And then, so what did you? Because you've obviously been very busy. Did you suddenly think, what the hell? People talking about this band that I once managed. What was that? What was that like when that came onto the radar?
Well, it was kind of amazing. So I stayed in touch a little bit with Mike. I remember seeing him play in St. Augustine, Florida at one point. I think we were on vacation there and he was playing in a bar. So I went to see him. And so it's not like I didn't see him at all in all of those years. I remember Sheila Seal, the bass player.
Yes.
And, yeah, she came to a talk that I did in Manchester. And Martin Vincent, the guitarist, I saw him a couple of times too. So it's not like we completely stopped seeing each other, but we almost did. And yeah, I always knew we had a few like really significant young fans. So Chris Addison from Veep would come to all the early shows. So would Ian Lee. So would Maxine Peake. And apparently Maxine Peake was on Radio 4 or Radio 6 or somewhere or something talking about the Man from Delmonte, and they played one of the songs, and so there was always like a little,
Yeah.
sort of bubbling of them. And yeah, Ian Lee told me uh, that he'd convinced them to reform and play a show, and I immediately booked a plane ticket and flew to the Band on the Wall in Manchester to see it.
And that was probably in the last couple of weeks, wasn't it, at that
Yeah,
stage?
yeah,
So was that the first time you'd seen all of the band since 1990 in the same room? Did you ever see a series in the 90s called Our Friends in the North, which had a great
yes.
cast? And it was a lovely bit right at the end where they're sort of all much older, and I think they had been at a funeral. And I was wondering how they're going to write this scene, and there was a moment where they suddenly realised they were the only people in the room as they were looking at each other, and one of them was playing the piano, and it was kind of so beautifully done. I'll never forget that. I think that's how you always want to sort of have occasionally there's odd friends, or the not odd friends, but just relationships and past. You think, I hope I have an ending like that with them, because that was kind of gorgeous. Did you have a moment with the band, the five of you?
Yeah, I did, and it was really lovely. Like it was such a lovely night. It was kind of perfect. It was a perfect night. It was perfect because they played brilliantly. Also, back in the old days, we'd only ever do, the Muff Monty would only ever do 45-minute sets, but they played for over 2 hours the other night. And they were really tight. They were just as good as they ever were. Also, they were all in pretty good shape. They didn't look like kind of horrific older versions of the Man for Monty. They all looked pretty good. So
There was no Phil Collins, coming on stage with a wheelchair being.
none of that. They were extremely tight. The audience were so, the show sold out in 20 minutes. So everybody who was there really wanted to be there. Everybody was singing along. I was singing along to every word of every song. I hadn't forgotten. With one or two exceptions, I remembered every line to every song. And so did the entire audience. And sitting on the side of the stage, watching them was fantastic. But also, yeah, seeing them backstage. And I tell you what I thought was interesting was, which I didn't expect, because Ian Lee was like running the night.
Yes.
But my management brain immediately kicked in the minute I was there. Like, you can't be on stage late. We can't keep people waiting. Oh my God, the support band's gone over by 10 minutes. Does that mean? So I spent the whole show thinking those thoughts, like, just, and it's what I do when I do my own talks these days. Like, I'm just very aware of making sure the audience are happy.
Yes.
So much of the night with the man from Delmonte was actually spent thinking those thoughts. Like, we can't go on late, we don't want to, like, make the audience, impatient, all of that stuff. I spent a lot of the night thinking those thoughts, just
Excellent.
like I did back in the late 1980s.
Nice
But
little
yeah,
bit
we
of...
went off to a cafe I'm extremely fond of the man from Delmonte, I hope they feel the same way. It was a very special period. I think they're just as talented as I did then. Maybe one problem with the man from Delmonte is that the way to really experience them at their very best is to be in the room as they're playing.
Yes.
Some of the songs recorded very well, like Water in My Eyes, but seeing them, even a live concert doesn't do it justice. It's the live experience of being with them in a room. That's when people really get it with the man from Delmonte. So that's always been a kind of challenge in a way.
Yes, it's kind of a difficult one. I know somebody else I interviewed who was in New York who runs a small, very niche little record label and blog. He actually got tickets to go from New York as well to Manchester
Oh,
to see them as well, which was
and do you
just...
know whether he enjoyed it?
oh God, he loved it. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, he was very happy. Yes,
Really good. A little bit like I said before about there was something I can't remember. There was I was bemoaning of somebody who should have made it and didn't. Um, I feel the same way about the man from Delmonte. I really think they should have been huge. It was bad timing because the Roses and the Mondays kind of killed us.
but then I
But
guess, because hindsight and all that, but I guess a few years later, Britpop appears, doesn't it? And you have people like Pulp who've been hanging around since the I don't know, mid-80s, who suddenly hit it. I guess the man from Delmonte, if they could have hung on for about 3 more years and got that little wave of Britpop excitement, they could have just had a
yeah,
moment or two.
I agree. I think it could have happened. I think you're absolutely right. They fitted much more into that world of Blur and Pulp than they did in the Stone Roses and Happy Mondays.
Yes. So then you had to walk, and was that the last with Frank as well? Was that the last musical moment you had in that field?
Yeah, yeah. As I say, I wrote the movie Frank, which was a sort of tribute to outsider artists. So I guess that was sort of me going back into it,
Yes.
but from a writing perspective.
So
But
then,
really, that was it. Yeah.
and that was it, the end, as Jim Morrison said. So then, how do you then, just briefly then, how does the rest of the 90s pan out at this stage?
Well, I moved back to London. I got very lucky that I was there for Manchester, and then I moved to London, basically because as it's been very well documented, when Manchester ended, things got very sketchy. There was guns, there was a lot
Yes.
of drugs. Somebody died at the hacienda. There were shootings, and a lot of burglaries and so on, and that kind of impacted me. So I got in my car and drove to London and moved to London just before Britpop happened. So I was in London again. I got to see all the really iconic shows. I saw. I went to. Well, one of my big moments was I became friendly with Alex from Blur,
Right.
and I was in his flat in Covent Garden, and he said, "This sounds apocryphal, but I swear to God, this is true." He said, "Oh, we recorded an amazing song this afternoon. I want you to be the first people to hear it." So it was me, and I think Jamie Hewlett, who ended up being the Gorillaz designer.
Oh,
Uh,
yes, yes, yes.
yeah, and a couple of other people. And he put on this song, and it was Parklife. Uh, so I, so I heard Parklife about 3 hours after it was created.
God, so you were right there. So how did
Yeah,
you cope with the sort of the hedonistic 90s in London with the cocaine, champagne, slightly lad culture? The Loaded magazine gang were sort of bubbling up at this point with James Brown. How did you navigate the 90s then?
well, I actually worked for Loaded in the early days. I wrote 3 or 4 pieces for them right at the beginning before Loaded turned horrific. There was a moment to it. And I thought the Loaded documentary, which was on quite recently on the BBC, I think it was,
Yes.
captured it very well, captured the fact that Loaded in its early days was this kind of exciting, experimental thing, which very quickly devolved into horror. But so I was there before it devolved. I was there when it was still good.
Yes.
But I'd had my fill of drugs in the 80s. I'd had a couple of bad drug experiences. I took too much cocaine one night, and that was bad for my health. And I took too much LSD one night, like back in the mid 80s. And so I gave up drugs. I used to joke that I was probably the only person to move to Manchester to get away from drugs. So by the time the late 80s came along and I was managing the man from Delmonte, I was drug free, and that remained the case when Britpop happened. Everybody else was taking cocaine and I wasn't.
Yes. And
It's a
again,
very
there was
good, I definitely recommend having some bad drug experiences right at the beginning, because then you won't get hooked.
yes, and LSD is quite heavy. Did you get into those performance poets at that stage, like Murray Lachlan Young, the £1 million poet? And there was a lot of kind of exciting showbiz going on during that phase as well, wasn't there? Which
Yeah,
started with sort of Suede Elastica and then My Life Story, and every band had a little orchestra, a little string section, didn't they? They loved the string sections. So did you
yeah.
sort of keep interested in music during the 90s?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I started doing radio shows again. So because I skipped this part, but when I was in Manchester, I used to do a late night radio show with Craig Cash and Carolina Hearn
Oh,
and
Caroline.
Terry Christian as well. We were the four who would like do this late night show on this indie station called KFM. So sometimes I'd co-present with Craig Cash, sometimes with Terry Christian, sometimes I'd do it alone. Carolina Hearn would do the 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. slot, and she'd co-present with Craig, and then that's how the two of them ended up moving into the Mrs. Merton and the royal family. So KFM was kind of supposed to be championing Manchester music, and that's what Craig,
Yes.
pretty much everything Craig played was like Manchester music. And I played a lot of Manchester music, but I also played a lot of kind of grunge and Pixies and so on. And so the Pixies would come in and be interviewed, and the Violent Femmes came in, and Manchester bands all the time. The World of Twist.
Oh,
I would argue that the World of Twist, Sons of the Stage, is the best forgotten song from that period. I think Sons of the Stage is better than anything that the Stone Roses or the Happy Mondays ever did. I would say.
because yeah, was it Gordon who wrote his book recently as well, didn't he?
Yeah, very good
But,
book.
yes.
Yeah, so then when I moved to London, I started doing some DJing too in radio stations, and so I remember Elastica would come in, and that was on BBC Greater London Radio, GLR.
Yes. God,
But
that's
yeah, but I went to the Blur. Blur put on this famous concert at the Walthamstow Dog Track, and I went to that. And I went to see them at Mile End Stadium, their big kind of launch party for Park Life. Uh, and so yeah, I got to experience a big musical movement for a second time. I went from that.
yes. Well, that was the John Major years. So then, how did you navigate the late 90s and Team Tony going into the Millennium Bug and all that kind of world? Were you still doing radio and writing at this stage?
Actually, I'd got my work by then. I sometimes wonder why I sort of have forgotten so much of that period. And I think the reason is because my work really took off. So I was basically, I made this documentary called Tottenham Ayatollah, and I wrote my first book, Them. And so I was constantly in America getting, trying to sneak into secret societies with Alex Jones and getting chased away from Bilderberg meetings and hanging out with David Icke and, all of these like great adventures. And that was all like the late 90s. So that was really when I stopped thinking about other people's culture and started thinking about my own, I suppose.
Yes. And how
Yeah.
did you, and why, what attracted you to the extreme groups at this stage?
I just mysteries. To this day, it's just if there's something mysterious about the world, something in the shadows that I don't understand, um, that I want to, I want to dive in and understand it. So with the extremists, that my big Damascus moment, I suppose, was the realization that there was a relationship between political and religious extremism and conspiracy theories. And now everybody kind of knows that. But I was a very early realizer of that. So that's why my book then became sort of influential, because it was really the first book to draw that comparison. So that was why I jumped in. I was like, I had this great idea that if all of these political extremists all believe that there's a shadowy cabal secretly ruling the world, that I'll hook up with them and we'll travel around the world and we'll try and find the shadowy cabal, and then we'll get into their secret meeting and confront them red-handed going about their covert wickedness. So I spent like 3 or 4 years having these adventures with conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones, trying to do that. For me,
Yes.
it was like just great, absurd comedy.
Yes. Well, it's kind of interesting. There is one person, I'd forgotten this. I did 2 interviews with the same person. He wasn't happy with the first one, but he's absolutely obsessed with the whole conspiracy thing and COVID and the moon, the whole flat Earth, the moon, and it was just
Yeah.
like I was thinking, oh my God, okay. And then he emails me and says, please never put that interview out, and it's like, oh, I don't think
Yeah.
I will. But it was kind of sitting here like this, listen to it, and he'd really had it all thought out and had a day job and was still releasing records. But he had kind of got into that world with Lawrence Fox and just a whole lot of them. It was like I started examining, looking at his friends on Facebook or his other social media sites and thinking, oh my God, you hang out with this world. No wonder that must be everything must be such a conspiracy. Everything must be like, God, it's planted.
Mm.
Even the innocent thing like, what they do to sort of, if you're having a heart attack, those machine things, I can't remember what they are now, but, it was like, oh my God, that's the government. They're sort of infiltrating. I think, no, it's just trying to save someone's life. It was very odd. It made you
Yes.
feel a bit dizzy afterwards, thinking, wow, that's, a bit like that character in Naked, it's like your brain must be just seeing,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
lining
Well,
these
welcome
things.
to my world. That's the world I've been in for 40 years, pretty much.
And had
Yeah.
David Icke gone full David Icke by then?
Yeah, I made this documentary and chapter in them called David Icke, the Lizards and the Jews. And it's basically the question it posits is, when David Icke says there are giant lizards secretly ruling the world, does he really mean lizards, or is he using code? And what he really means is Jews. So that was that was the question I tried to solve while hanging out with David Icke.
Yes, God, that's interesting. Because I did sort of, sometimes you have these moments, watch him having these interviews with a man in a very stripy pinstripe suit, asking him very easy questions and him just going on and on for ages. And my attention span sort of going slightly, because, poorly. Because I sort of got very into hippiedom, I suppose, when I was younger, and then that merged into New Ageism. But I was always quite cynical of lots of it. But I noticed that most of them during the COVID period, and why I probably won't be friends with them, I had slightly parted anyway, they just had gone political with the new age feeling thoughts. So
Yeah.
they linked all these things up as well. So have you come across a lot of the new age movement as well, which became
Oh yeah,
um,
very much so. Well, there's a big crossover between QAnon and sort of wellness people, which I kind of understand. Wellness has always been about, mistrusting big pharma and, um, wanting, to come up with like alternative medicines and homeopathy and that kind of stuff. So I understand, like at the beginning, I thought this is a surprise that so many sort of wellness hippies are now joining forces with, anti-Semites and, various conspiracy theorists, who you would imagine to be much kind of darker than them. But actually, it makes sense. It's the war on institutions is what it is. That's what connects them all. They don't trust institutions.
So when you come to the Russell Brand character, you think, oh, it all fits into place, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. But Russell Brand, there's this added kind of thing about Russell Brand that I think is absolutely fascinating, which is this sort of central question about Russell Brand right now, which is, he joined Rumble some months before the sexual assault allegations came out. Was he kind of reverse engineering? Like he knew these allegations were going to come out, so he wanted to surround himself with a community who automatically wouldn't believe them because they thought he was getting too close to the truth or not.
Yes.
Such an interesting question.
A good move. A good move. And then before that, we had Pizzagate, didn't we?
Yes.
That and at one stage, because did you work with Robbie Williams at one point?
Yes, yeah, I became quite close with Robbie Williams.
Because I once heard an interview with him a few years ago where he was almost kind of going with the Pizzagate thing, and I remember thinking, "Oh, Robbie, I quite like some of your stuff, but I'm not sure."
Right. Well, what's so nice about Robert is that I always think he has a sort of foot in both camps. He's, one foot is in the world of the true believer, and the other foot is in the world of skepticism. And I think that's kind of pretty healthy, that he'll have people like me around to sort of, offer the skeptical point of view. He's never gone full conspiracy theorist. Well, for instance, a lot of the QAnon people think he's part of the paedophile elite. And he said to me one time, well, I know that's not true about me, but does that mean it's also not true about Bill Gates? I don't know. So, yeah.
Yes, God, so that's your main thing now. You're sort of, that's your full-time gig.
Oh no, I've done all sorts of things. I wrote a book about public shaming. I wrote a book about psychopaths. No, I mean, the whole conspiracy stuff was really the stuff that I did in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I feel like I've, got into a lot of other areas since then. I mean, it's fun to, I go back from time to time, like going UFO hunting with Robbie Williams, or and I made the show for the BBC called Things Fell Apart, which have some conspiracy theorist elements to it. But I definitely don't think it's the thing that I've just done. I think I've done a bunch of other things too.
Yes. So yes, okay. And then going forward, what are you working on at the moment, apart from seeing the man from Delmonte and they have got more dates, haven't they? They've got more dates coming up, I believe.
Yeah, apparently they're doing a show in London. I strongly recommend people go and see them. Like they're really, really good. I always thought they were better than a lot of the similar bands. Like I always liked them more than the Soup Dragons. I know that your audience will be into kind of bands like that, but they're very talented. They reminded me of the House Martins at their best, or
right, yes,
Monochrome Set at their best. So yeah, anyway, I strongly, if you're into that kind of music, I strongly.
Well, the one thing I've really noticed, having done this show, and I've done well over 1,000 interviews, actually, the people who were in bands during that period, and at the time, I mean, I liked it, but I didn't realise how passionate and not tortured, but how committed they were to making the absolutely best music they could, and how talented most people were. So I've gone back and discovered lots of bands I missed the first time, because it was quite hard always to hear records and get access to them. There was no streaming, there was a record library, or you had to pay money to sometimes try and acquire a record. But I've gone back to listen to loads of these artists and albums that I missed, and just can't believe how good most of it is. It's, I mean, you had the mainstream, but then you had all these other tribes in the 80s, and sometimes you just didn't go in. I personally wasn't a goth, but now I listen to a lot of that music and think, oh, this is absolutely amazing.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, when you listen, because we haven't mentioned the Chameleons. They were one of those bands who were just, I listened to their albums and Easterhouse as well. I think they were from Manchester, weren't they? And both
I
of
got to
them.
know Mark. I got to know Mark from the Chameleons a bit, and he was a lovely man. But I never got that into the Chameleons. Never got that into Easterhouse. Uh, yeah. Oh no, I remember what I was going to say. When you were saying all of that stuff, I just remembered a moment when Stephen Malkmus from Pavement went on the Mark Maron podcast, and Mark Maron said to him, "Do you think if you tried harder, you would have been more successful?" And Stephen Malkmus replied, "I think we tried very hard." But it did make me think that just because a band's songs may sound a little shambolic, like Pavement does sometimes, doesn't mean they weren't trying very hard. Just like you said.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it started. I don't know if you saw the Wedding Present film. When they about making George Best and how difficult that had become and how they were trying to get this sound. And I think at the time I just thought it was all a bit like just go in the studio, bang it out. But there was the drummer problem they had to get rid of, producer problem they had to deal with to try and make this perfect indie pop album. But at the time, perfect indie pop albums seemed to be appearing every week. We had the Triffids, we had the Chills, the Go-Betweens, the Smiths. There was like just endless good music at that point. That
Yes.
It was quite relentless. So
Yeah.
so it was kind of interesting to hear dear old David Gedge with his thoughts about making that album and the story of the poor old drummer who got dismissed. It was a tragic story.
Right, I don't know the story. I should watch it. I like The Wedding Present, so I should watch that film.
Yes, and I think there might even be a musical about the wedding, or written by David Gedge, and perhaps he's going to do a rock opera or something. It's all in the pipelines. But look, Jon, thank you ever so much. Anyway, look, we're rambling now, aren't we? But this has been brilliant, and it's nice to have got the story of that little other part of the jigsaw, the man from Delmonte, and your musical moment with them.
Yeah, as I say, I think if they're playing in your town, listeners, go and see them.
Go and see them. You won't be disappointed. Did you buy a T-shirt?
No. I've got a real thing about fabrics. I find it very difficult to wear. No.
No.
It's like cotton. Actually, maybe that it was actually the Mumford and Monty t-shirts were Fruit of the Loom, and that's pretty classy, right? So
yes.
Yeah, maybe I should have.
Never mind. I'm sure they'll send you one. But anyway, look, have a lovely. Oh, so what is it's 5:30 here. So what's the time with you now?
Oh, it's 1:30 because it's a 4-hour difference this time of year. But,
right.
Yes.
Oh, so is that going to be the same with California as well?
Yes, you're going to be 7 hours different instead of 8.
Because I've got a few interviews next week with people in California. I better check that.
Well, if your clock didn't go back last night, which it clearly did. No, unless your clock goes back tonight.
No, it won't.
Right. Goes forward, I mean, then yes, you should double check. This is the confusing couple of weeks where everybody's so used to it being a 5-hour difference or an 8-hour difference.
Yes.
Time of year, it's a 4-hour difference and
It's a 4 hours. Right. Thank you for the top tip. This is important stuff. Otherwise.
Okay, well, look, I'm going to go. I'm going to
yes, okay, I'll go too.
But very nice to talk to you. I'm glad you're doing important historical work.
Yes, I know. And yes, all the best for the rest of the year, and keep on trucking, as they say.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye. And that is the end of the interview. You probably gathered from the general chat at the end there. Anyway, this has been a massive thank you to Jon Ronson for that. This has been the C86 show. If you want to contact me, you can just go to any of the social media platform sites, do C86 show in my name, David Eastaugh. That should get through. And also, all these interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. So that's it. Have a great week. Stay safe.